Biomimicry is innovation inspired by nature. It's the process of looking at something like a leaf and trying to figure out how to make a better solar cell. It's become popular in the design disciplines, mainly I think because people are looking for more sustainable ways to do things. And organisms know how to do this. After 3.8 billion years, life has learned what works and what's appropriate on the planet. And right now, that's what the people trying to redesign our world are looking for. What we do in biomimicry is we bring in biologists to the design table. We look at how does nature contain liquids? How does nature repel water? So for instance, go outside, look at any leaf and the veins in a leaf, and what you're seeing is the world's best water distribution network. There's an amazing thing called the Murray's Law that says that all branching structures in the natural world, including our lungs, they all follow a single mathematical formula. And it has to do with the pipe branches, and it drops down to a smaller diameter, and then it branches again, and that drops down to a smaller diameter. And that's predictable. People in green building now are starting to say, well, maybe our 90-degree angles that we have in plumbing are really friction devices. Maybe we should distribute electricity differently in a building, water differently in a building, even gases, even air conditioning differently in a building by mimicking this Murray's Law in our plumbing. The most important thing that people should know is that a sustainable world already exists. We're just now beginning to open our eyes and realize that the answers to the questions we've been asking, how do we live here sustainably, are all around us. And I think when most people think of Stanford, they think of a generative academic environment, meaning you create businesses, you create inventions. You also create people who think differently, but there is a use-directed ethos here that I really like, and biomimicry is very much about invention, reimagining pretty much every aspect of our world using this incredible patent database that is, the R&D is 3.8 billion years instead of 150 years. So there's an incredible opportunity, not just in individual technologies that we can learn from that are frankly inherently sustainable because they need to be. If they've survived this long, there's a reason. You know, they fit within the context, the operating environment of Earth. But also living systems thinking, which is perhaps the next wave of this, of biomimicry, which is you're not just designing products here or technologies here, you're also designing businesses and new approaches to how we organize ourselves as a society here at Stanford. And I think, you know, moving from the machine age to this living systems or biological age, we need to get good at actually understanding how living systems work and what biology can offer us. So this biomimicry is a methodology for bringing biology into your design thinking on every level. Let me paint for you what's happened in the field in the last 15 years. Even if you aren't interested in biomimicry, it is an object lesson in how a meme naturalizes in the culture. 15 years ago, I had written 5 books in the natural sciences, natural history writer. My specialty was plant and animal adaptations, i.e. nature's technologies. That's what I wrote about all day long. And that's what I researched for 15 years prior to this move. And then I saw this emerging discipline, which was at that point a very faint signal in the scientific literature. It was in academia. Interestingly, for those of you interested in memes, it didn't have a coherent name. how important language is. It didn't have a name. So there were agriculturalists looking to the prairie to come up with a new kind of agriculture that was polyculture and perennial instead of annual and monoculture. That was called natural systems agriculture. There were people looking at how plants pick, how animals pick their own medicines and how they self-medicate as a way to focus in on drug plants, mimicking their choosing. That was called zoopharmacognosy, which just trips off the tongue. There were people looking at how spiders make their webs, how rhinos have self-healing horns, how abalone shells are twice as tough as our high-tech ceramics. Those folks were doing biomimetic materials, so that was biomimetics. There was bionics. There were all of these basically siloed into disciplines. What they didn't realize, the people in the book, and I wrote about all these different fields, but the people in the, and there were, industrial ecology was the application of ecosystems thinking to businesses, to co-locating businesses in food webs, essentially, so that they were feeding on each other's waste streams. Well, guess whose phone that is. Anyway, sorry, Beth. Yeah, can you find it in there? It's probably in the black thing. So anyway, so it starts out being fragmented, and so I basically wrote a reportage book which said, look, what all these have in common is they're looking to the natural world for inspiration. And not just inspiration, blueprints. Form, blueprints, process, chemistry, mimicry, ecosystem mimicry on the business, on the meta economy scale. And that was kind of a revelation. It didn't have a word, so the word biomimicry, I named it biomimicry at that point. And that has made a huge difference. Now watch in 15 years. So I went back and started writing my next book. I had no idea. I thought, here's a good idea. This is a book about academic research in this field. This is about folks at ASU looking at leaves to come up with new solar cells, and here it is. Here's the academic research. My whole goal in writing the book was, please send money here to these researchers. This is important stuff. Now here's what happens. In 15 years ago, our culture was very different. Now it would happen probably in 5. Don't you think, Todd? It would happen more quickly. But what happened was companies started to call and say, the academic research is all good and well, but we're trying to solve problems right now. We have an R&D lab here. Could you send your biologists over? Assuming I had a company full of biologists, which I did not. And so sitting there in my pajamas made an executive decision, seriously, to and at that time my business partner met me, who was a PhD student at the University of Montana, and she just read the book and said, let's do this. Okay, so this is the kind of thing, since there's mostly students here, this is the kind of thing that actually happens. This is not a fairy tale. So my business partner to this day, Dana Baumeister, called me up and said, I just shook for 3 days reading this book. I want to do this for my career. And I had just gotten all these calls from GE and Interface and Nike and all these companies saying, bring over your biologists. And I was like, I'll get back to you. And then Dana called, and I said, come on down. And so what we were faced with at that point was a design problem of pretty high magnitude, which was how do you create the infrastructure needed for an emerging discipline? How do you train a workforce? How do you create a methodology of how to look to the natural, how to read the biological literature functionally, pull out function, and present those biological blueprints, those design principles, in a way that somebody actually can invent from them, which is a big trick, actually. So that methodology we developed, then we began to train people in that. At the same time, we were working in innovation labs of companies. And that was in 1998. About 2006, we realized, hey, we really need to we need to train a bunch of people in this. From K through 12 in university, we started an institute, a nonprofit. But what we had to actually put in place were, we had to train people and we had to create tools. So the people training, we're still doing it right here. And the tools are tools like Ask Nature. If you look, one of the big things that we did was create a database of biological strategies in the natural world, organized by design and engineering function. So you can type in, how does nature filter salt from water? And up will come the strategies from mangroves, the strategies from penguins. So asknature.org, which we're about to launch a 2.0. We're working on it, not to launch, but build a 2.0. Anyone who's interested in that, please talk to Beth or myself afterwards. Creating a database of biological solutions so that any inventor anywhere in the world could ask a functional question in their language and find biological information was something that had not been done before. So that tool was really very, very important. And training people was very important. So what happened then, much to our surprise, was that the people that we trained, and we've got an 8-month course and a 2-year course that we're now just looking, ASU is looking to accredit that 2-year course, which will be great. Those people went back to their home countries. We usually have people from 5 continents it's very global. They went back to their home countries, whether it was China or Japan, Egypt, Czech Republic, South Africa. I mean, it's Mexico, and created regional networks. So that's the next thing that's happened. So we have about 30 regional networks that have started up around the world. That was an emergent property from giving away this meme and teaching other people to do this work and be leaders in this. They went back, and there's a big hub here. San Francisco has a Bay Area Swarm, it's called. Okay. They're starting a business incubator. Other people are doing economic development plays. I just got back from New York State, and they have 9 new businesses that have biomimetic inventions because they want New York State to be a hub for biomimicry. Same thing's happening in the Great Lakes. It's a really interesting phenomenon. So now it's moved into its network phase. We were talking about this and how these movements happen. And so you've got, I think, when you look at where the key things that happened, the key sort of pivot points, was it moving from purely academia into industrial design labs and private architecture studios. Okay, that was and design studios. That was a really big thing. And then other people coming back and getting trained in this. And when I talk about the training, it's not just biologists at the design table that we train. We have cohorts we have a mixed cohort in our 8 and 2-year courses. We've got business students, engineers, designers, and biologists all together. So you can be an engineer and you want to specialize in biomimicry thinking, right? Or you can be a biologist at the design table. So this has been a very, very, very interesting thing. The other thing that we've seen, besides the move into industry and people wanting to now have careers in this, the second thing we've seen is that a sequence of application areas come towards us. I have my own theories about why things started first, but the first application area was interesting to me. It was architecture and green building space. There wasn't an architecture chapter in the book, so that was kind of interesting to me. And that has gone on now to have, and I'll talk a little bit about these 3 areas, is biomimicry and green building, and in resilient city design. The green building part of this, if you know anything about the Living Building Challenge, which is sort of, you know about LEED. Or do folks know about LEED, which is this green rating standard for buildings? In the US and increasingly worldwide, there's versions of this. The next layer of sort of the next evolutionary jump is living building challenge, which is very biomimicry based. And then I'll talk a little bit about cities later. That was the first application area, the built world, which is great because there's a lot of impact. If we get the built world right, we get a lot right. The second was product design, industrial product design. Third was engineering. We've had people come towards us and say, how do you apply biomimicry to finance and economics, to business models? And I think the next phase where we're having people come towards us is around leadership science. And so if you know biology, it's a very, very broad scope of functions that organisms and ecosystems accomplish. So in each of those, if you're talking about structural engineering, you're talking about how does nature manage compressive forces. If you're talking about management and leadership, you're talking about how does nature cooperate, communicate, stay resilient, learn and adapt. So you're taking the new scientific understanding in those areas and applying it to business models. So it's a very broad, and that's what makes it exciting. The full spectrum of biological information, and the fact that because we introduced interdisciplinary folks into our courses, they are now bringing it and telling us what it means. You know, a woman in our 8-month course is coming out with a new book called The Nature of Investing. She's used to be the head of research at Fidelity. Giles Hutchins, who took our course, has a book now out called The Nature of Business. Tamsin Woolley Barker is coming out with a book on the nature of transformational change in organizations. So there's a really, really interesting sort of progression of applications coming towards us. And I say that to you to say that, you know, if you've just heard of it as product design, that's because that's where we've been focusing, because those were that's who came to us. And I think if the tipping point is 16% of those professionals knowing the word biomimicry and understanding something about it, I think we're in the engineering, product design, or certainly in built world and product design, I think we've hit that tipping point. And what and agriculture we haven't. There's 3 areas that I'm looking at sort of next gen biomimicry thinking. And that we're talking a lot about, and we're starting to build up biological intelligence about. And one of them is cities. So resilient cities. How does biomimicry fit in there? I think the most impactful thing that we've done with cities is something, and again, we built all this with our clients, so it's very use-directed when we do our research. We do it for a client. And we did this for HOK, which is, at that time, I think they're about 2nd largest now in the world architecture engineering firm. We looked at something called the genius of place process. And this is something that we realized that the biological intelligence that we collect about a local area does not overlap with what other people are collecting. I mean, when developers come in or architects come in and planners come in, of course they're looking at things like solar angle, what are the soils like? There's looking at certain levels of biological intelligence. But what we brought to the table that was what was new is a 3-part process, the genius of place process. The first is, what are the ecological realities of this place? So what we do as ecologists, we hire ecologists to do this research. And I thought of you, Noah, where are you? Is he here? Oh. Yeah, I thought of you. Your work with the Everglades when we were talking about how do you keep a regime like the Everglades from flipping into another regime when There's key slow variables. They're called key slow variables in resilience science. I could also call them the Achilles heel of a place. So in the Everglades, for instance, if you went in and you wanted to build in that area, you should know that there's a slow drip of phosphorus going into the Everglades. And that when that hits a certain level, that vegetation type is going to flip. And it's not going to have the same functionality. You could lose it. So it's two things in ecological realities is what makes this place tick ecologically? What's the important thing about Phoenix or the important thing about New York, the ecological area? The second thing is, what's its Achilles heel? And what cliff should we stay away from in our building? Literally, a metaphoric cliff. The second part of Genius of Place process is to look at the organisms that are already there and ask them how they're meeting their functions. If they're in Phoenix, how are the cacti caching water? What are the functional strategies that have been evolved over long periods of time for this place? Finding those design principles and presenting the design teams with 10 design principles, 15 design principles of that place that every team works on. Okay, so those design principles can be something like in the Northeast, with a deluge of rain, what happens? Those systems slow them. They slow water down by hitting leaves, by hitting branches, by hitting the trunks. They sink it and they store it. So one of the design principles might be water, slow it, sink it, store it. Now how do you apply that to a city like New York? Hurricane Sandy, you might, as you have design folks around the table, they might say, all right, well, we've got a bunch of green roofs, we've got different roof lines. Let's connect the green roofs to one another. And as water falls, we're connecting that water that overflows to the next green roof and the next green roof, and then that's captured in permeable pavement at the base of the building, and then that goes into a cistern that when you know a storm is coming, you might empty that cistern so you can create the same level of storage. So those sorts of design principles we literally take from best practices of organisms. Imagine the best practices of organisms in New Orleans, right? So literally what we do is we go and we look at studies that say, after Hurricane Sandy, what natural systems, salt marshes, did well? Which dunes did not blow away? And we look at what those principles were, okay? That's the second part of Genius of Place. The third part is ecological performance standards. Now this is pretty impactful because this is at the level of policy. So what we do there is we say, let's go to a healthy reference ecosystem next door in that area, in New York City or in San Francisco. What is the ecological land type here? And let's go to the scientific literature, and scientists have to baseline a healthy system. They often will do manipulations on a system. Like they'll baseline a forest, and then they'll do a cutting, okay, to see what changes. So the data that they're taking are things like, in its healthiest state, the forest of this area stores this much water, builds this much soil, filters this much air, cools to this temperature, right? Those are the baselines. That's health. That becomes the metric for the city manager. And I find that fascinating. So imagine, we've done it in India and China. We've never had the opportunity to do it here, but we're trying to get a Genius of Place done for San Francisco. Now imagine if San Francisco signed off on a set of metrics that said each year we have to build this much soil in the city per acre. We have to cool to this level. We have to capture this much water, filter this much water. The ecosystem services, there's about 20 of them. Say it's pollination. You have to meet a certain level rate of, you have to support so much pollination. So for each green roof, if you have a metric like that, you suddenly are incented to put a hive up there. It changes design. It changes these metrics, these aspirational goals, and they are aspirational. Our cities right now are not generous. They don't really produce cleaner air than they take in. But it's possible. So if you're standing in New York City and you go up to the top of the Bank of America building with Bob Fox, the architect, he will tell you that they created, it's the second largest building now in New York City. They created that building so that the air exiting it is 3 times cleaner than the air that comes in. That, I said, Bob, you're well on your way to meeting your block's ecological performance standards for air. This is really powerful because, Peter Senge talks about this image of our aspirational goals are up here, and here we are. And what we need is the aspirational goals create an elastic band between where we are and here, and it pulls us towards them. So I think biomimicry has this ability to have a framework kind of metric that says meet or exceed the same level of ecosystem services as the wildland next door. And suddenly that one thing can really change both, because it's not just plant more trees or plant a green roof. You can't let the eco-structure, the green part, do all the work for you. It's also, hey, we've got a metric to store this much carbon per acre. Shoot, how's the building going to do that? Well, maybe it's Calera, the company here in California that takes CO2 and makes cement out of it and sequesters half a ton of CO2 for every ton of concrete. Well, maybe you're incented to use that kind of concrete because you've got a carbon metric. Really, really powerful. So this gives you an idea of where sort of biomimicry is going. So that's in the city space. Stuff. Second one, stuff. The story of stuff. Have you guys seen the story of stuff video? Check that out. Obviously, our make, waste, linear throughput, high throughput, how fast can we get this thing to the landfill? It's not a good, it's bad design. It's just bad design. It's embarrassing. I mean, we have got, you guys, you're at Stanford, like, I should let you go right now. Go solve that. That's craziness. Circular economy. We have an ability, I think, we're looking at this third industrial revolution, this possibility in front of us to actually do what nature does. And I'm talking about the additive manufacturing. I'm going to jump on that bandwagon, the 3D printing bandwagon. I've been saying it for a long time because it does allow us to think about manufacturing coming back to our neighborhoods. Yeah, I think we're going to have desktop printers, but even more than that, I think you're going to walk into Famous Footwear, and instead of having 5,000 boxes of shoes, you're going to have 22. Take the shoe back to Famous Footwear, put it in an enzyme bath, and it goes back into the printer. So we have an opportunity to go back, to loop it back if we want. We have an opportunity to cut the shipping, to have those designs crisscrossing the globe, not products, designs. The problem is, we're still in second industrial revolution thinking in our supply chain. So I think the person who greens the supply chain for 3D printing is going to do very, very, very well. And when I say green the supply chain, I don't mean manufacturing that goop or that, something, an alternative to ABS plastic. I don't mean manufacturing that somewhere else and shipping it to Famous Footwear where they can warehouse it. I mean taking CO2 and turning it into polymers, like a company called Novomer does. I mean literally getting local raw materials, benign manufacturing as nature does. I mean, I know this is possible because this is literally, I'm describing to you nature's manufacturing process. Local raw materials, easily procured and common. What life does is it adds structure, it adds design to simple materials. So let's just take polymers. If you look at The most common polymers in the natural world, there are about 5 of them. They're things like keratin, your hair, your fingernails, your skin, not just yours, but all organisms, hair, fingernails, skin, feathers, keratin. Cellulose, right? Everything green that you see out there. So there's some chitin, all insects, right? So 99% of all life on Earth is smaller than a bumblebee. That's a lot of chitin. Those are insects, right? And fungi, chitin. So what life does, though, is like, well, how does it add functionality to these materials? It adds it through design, through structure. So we have the opportunity with 3D printing, because we have computer build files, and we're doing it layer by layer, we have the ability not only to create a biomimetic shape on the outside, we have the ability to put the internal structure that makes biological materials so powerful inside. Okay, so the example would be the Wyss Center for Biologically Inspired Design. These are Harvard has its largest single endowment. 125 million came to Harvard instead of Stanford, sorry to say. The Wyss Center for Biologically Inspired Engineering. Check them out. Every week they're coming out with something new. It's WYSS, is it? Am I getting that right? Center for Biologically Inspired Engineering. Every week they're coming out with something. So here's a perfect example. Don Ingber has created a material called Shrilk. And the chitin is actually most biological materials are composites. Okay, so it's chitin. It's a chitin system. So it's chitin with a little bit of a silk-like fiber in it. So what they've done is they mimicked the internal architecture of insect exoskeletons. One of the internal architectures is you lay up, instead of just chitin might give you a particular kind of characteristic, but if you want it to be really, really strong, you lay it up in a plywood hatch, okay? If you want it to create color, think of a beetle's exoskeleton. If you want it to be metallic, you lay it up in a different structure, and it creates color to your eye. If you want it to be resilient or elastic, you take chitin and you lay it up in another structure, right? So this is what we mean by we say, take one material, add structure to it in the build file. When it comes out of the printer, you've got one material to recycle. Your shoe is made of one material. It's soft in places, it's hard in places, with structure. So what they've done with Shrilk is the simplest thing. It's the plywood hatch. They took the chitin, literally, and chitin is a waste stream from seafood manufacture, because it's also not just insects, it's all crabs. We burn that stuff now, or we bury it in landfills. That is such bad design. So you take a waste stream like chitin or something, or some polymer that is similar. You lay it up in a plywood hatch. They're making a plastic, biodegradable plastic that's transparent, that is as strong as aluminum with half the weight. Okay, so, and what did they do? Chitin by itself would not be as strong as aluminum. It just wouldn't. They have the chitin, they've got the silk in there, they lay it up in a plywood hatch. So what this says to me about 3D printing is that biomimicry has 4 places it intervenes in that system. Sourcing. How does nature take CO2 and make cellulose? All trees you see out there are made of CO2. All ceramics in the ocean are made of CO2, dissolved CO2, and calcium and carbonate. All shells, all coral reefs, right? Little magnesium thrown in for the coral reefs. So sourcing locally, and then the chemistry in the printer, biomimetic chemistry in the printer, nature doesn't use high heats. It doesn't use high pressures. It doesn't use a lot of toxins. So self-assembly, all the self-assembly work that's been going on for a long, long time in academia that I wrote about, and it's been going on like crazy, self-assembly. When that layer is put down, it's going to cross-link, it's going to self-assemble, it's going to have a different property as it self-assembles. The chemistry inside the printer, I'm hoping we don't have little volcanoes of heat. Let's get smart about that. I always just, this is my research agenda for all these students here. And then I can leave and I can just go have lunch and relax. So anyway, please, let's change the chemistry printer, the chemistry in the printer, biomimically. Third one is this build file. Let's create a library of biological forms and internal architectures that will allow structure to be added to 5 simple, say 5, I don't care. 2 simple materials that are infinitely recyclable. And then the fourth thing is return. So get that shoe back to Famous Footwear and do the chemistry in such a way that there is a way to unzip it at the end of its, not literally unzip it, but molecularly. Take those polymers, something like John Warner has done, which is, he's at Warner Babcock Institute outside of Boston. He's found a way to take monomers, polymer monomers, any kind of monomers, which are the building blocks of polymers, plastics, and basically decorate them with thymine molecules. If you know DNA, it's one of the DNA bases. What he did was he studied how your skin heals after a sunburn. So he decorates them with thymine. As you know, with DNA, adenine is supposed to go with thymine, A and T, right? When you get a sunburn, T and T come together. Whoops, that's a mistake. Thankfully, your body has a little enzyme that comes in and looks for mistakes and cuts them, called DNA photolyase. John takes the monomers, shines UV light on them, a lot of UV light, like a sunburn. He's decorated them with thymine. The thymines come together by mistake. They stay together for the life of the polymer. At the end of the polymer's life, he dips them in DNA photolyase, and the same trigger, UV light, causes the DNA photolyase to cut through those thymines and break them apart again. Unzippable polymers, that's, please, shall we take a break, and maybe in 20 you can come back and tell me what you, please. Okay, so 4 things, sourcing, chemistry in the printer, biological build files. Let's get everything we know about biological structure in a biological library of forms. Please Google, that we can download, that people, this is what we envision for Ask Nature 2.0. You're a designer, you want to put a skin on your train, say, and well, that would probably be made of powdered metals. Who knows, though? It may be made of very strong composite, who knows, polymers. Let's say it is. So you basically are able to download at Ask Nature perhaps a 3D model of a kingfisher's beak for the drag reduction, like they did in the high-speed train in Japan. But then the skin of the train, you want it to be water repellent. So you download a program that's going to create a lotus effect structure, which is a self-cleaning structure on your skin. You also download a build file that's going to lay it up in a particular way for the material you need. Those biological blueprints, to make biomimicry actionable, I think you're going to, instead, right now we have you reading biological papers on Ask Nature, which is very inspirational. You go, this is so cool, but I got to make this, and I got to make it in 18 months, and do you have something I can download? I'm an architect, and I'm reading about how nature handles compressive strength, and I love this, but do you have a truss that has this already in it that I can download? That's when we get cooking, without guess. That's when we get cooking, though. That is when we get cooking. When you can download the biological intelligence, right, in those, what we're calling biological blueprints. Someday in Ask Nature.